A farmer walks into a feed store for 100 pounds of chicken mash and walks out carrying the fabric for his wife's next dress. The sack isn't rough burlap, it's printed cotton covered in flowers, checks, or fashionable colors. And because an adult dress could require 2 or 3 matching sacks, somebody might have to move several 100 pounds of chicken feed just to find the right pattern. If you enjoy the overlooked details most history leaves out, subscribe because that's what we uncover here at America Then. But families turning sacks into dresses is only the first half of this story. The stranger part is what happened when feed companies realized the dress could determine which chicken feed a family bought. Across rural America, especially during the 1930s, 40s, and 50s, cotton sacks carried much more than animal feed. They also carried flour, sugar, salt, seed, and other dry goods. Once the contents were gone, the container still represented a useful piece of fabric. For a household watching every dollar, throwing it away made little sense. And these were not ready-made dresses waiting to be unfolded. The sack had to be opened along its chain stitching, washed, flattened, and inspected. Any company label or product information had to be removed, hidden, or worked around. Then the separate pieces had to be matched, measured, cut, and sewn on a household machine, often a treadle model powered entirely by the person using it. The result could be a child's shirt, a pair of overalls, an apron, pajamas, or a carefully fitted adult dress. This was recycling, but with considerably more skill than cutting 3 holes in a bag and hoping for the best. And the size of the garment created an immediate problem. One sack might provide enough cloth for something small. An adult dress could take 2 or 3 100-pound sacks, and for a single print dress, the fabric had to match. A blue flower from one print attached to a red check from another might be useful for a quilt, but it was not necessarily the dress someone hoped to wear into town. Families therefore saved sacks, traded them with neighbors, and asked feed dealers to watch for particular patterns. In oral histories, women remembered sending a piece of fabric with a husband who was going to buy feed so he could bring home the correct match. Feed store workers sometimes saved favored prints for regular customers. If the right floral sack was at the bottom of the pile, somebody was about to have a very long afternoon. So here's the first question. If the company label had been completely removed and nobody could recognize the material, would you have worn a feed sack dress? For many families, the answer was practical. The fabric was already available, while money for new yard goods might not be. But matching several sacks changed the value of the package. The family was not merely buying what was inside, it was also thinking about what the container could become. And that is where the story gets much bigger. This wasn't just a clever household shortcut anymore. The empty bag was beginning to influence which chicken went home in the first place, and that meant the companies selling chicken feed had unexpectedly entered the fashion business. Manufacturers learned that a plain sack and a beautifully printed sack did not look equally valuable to the customer. If 2 products served the same purpose, the pattern that might become a dress, curtain, or child's shirt could help decide the sale. The chickens needed the feed, but the household already had plans for the bag. Companies responded with colored fabrics, checks, stripes, and floral designs. They made labels easier to remove. Some printed patterns for dolls, doll clothes, and other projects directly onto the sack. Trade groups published sewing instructions showing women how to transform cotton bags into clothing and household goods. By the late 1940s, major bag manufacturers were employing professional textile designers and studying the patterns farm women preferred. Think about how strange that is. An industrial container had become a kind of fabric catalog. The person buying animal feed might arrive carrying a small cloth sample, Compare it with a stack of 100-pound sacks and leave with both livestock supplies and the missing piece of a dress. It was an early version of packaging designed for its second life. The unboxing experience simply involved more dust, more lifting, and considerably more chickens. If two feed brands worked equally well, would the better floral print have influenced your choice? Historical accounts show that for some households it did. That purchasing influence mattered because women's work was central to the system. They understood which fabric survived washing, which prints could be matched, how much cloth a project required, and how to turn an awkward rectangle into something a family could actually use. But the colorful patterns can make this history look more cheerful than it always felt.
Reusing commodity sacks did not suddenly begin with the Great Depression. Rural households had reused cloth bags before it, but the economic pressure of the Depression made every available piece of material more important. Then wartime shortages and limits on consumer goods extended that importance into the 1940s. Distance mattered too. For some rural families, reaching a town or fabric store was not a quick errand. Buying new cloth required cash, transportation, and access. The empty sack was already at home. That made it useful. It could also make it uncomfortable. For some people, feed sack clothing represented thrift, sewing ability, and a family's determination not to waste anything. For others, a visible company name announced that the garment had begun as packaging. Women soaked printed areas, dyed cloth, added ribbon or rickrack, and positioned pieces carefully so a finished dress would look less like a reused bag and more like something purchased from a store. Sometimes the company marking refused to disappear. The sack had lost its chicken feed, but apparently it wasn't ready to stop advertising. That joke had a serious side. A label in the wrong place could expose economic hardship a family was trying not to display. Resourcefulness and embarrassment could exist in the same garment. We should admire the labor without pretending that every person wearing feed sack clothing felt fortunate to do so. The remarkable part is that rural women did more than adapt to the packaging. Their preferences began shaping it. Feed dealers learned which customers wanted particular prints. Neighbors exchanged material to complete projects. Husbands were sent back with samples to locate a match. Manufacturers surveyed women's preferences, hired textile designers, and promoted cotton bag sewing through booklets, patterns, fashion shows, and competitions. The Smithsonian even preserves a floral dress made in 1959 for a cotton bag sewing contest. By then, the feed sack was no longer merely a substitute for store-bought fabric. Industry organizations were presenting it as material worthy of design and competition. A rural homemaker who rarely appeared in conventional fashion histories had become important enough that companies wanted to know which colors and patterns she would choose. Now follow one printed sack through a house. First, its fabric becomes a dress. Scraps from the dress become trim for a child's shirt. Other sacks with the same print become curtains. Worn pieces move into a quilt. Plain sacks become towels, pillowcases, table covers, aprons, undergarments, or diapers. Eventually, even badly worn cloth can be reduced to cleaning rags. The point is not that every household made every one of these objects. It is that the sack belonged to an entire system of reuse. Material moved through the home until very little useful cloth remained. The family was not saving one bag, it was managing a small textile supply that arrived disguised as grocery and farm packaging. But just as manufacturers became remarkably good at selling reusable cloth, a cheaper container began pushing it aside. Paper bags cost less. Changes in farming and retail reduced the old flow of cotton commodity sacks.
Ready-made clothing and commercial fabric became more accessible. Cotton feed sack production declined during the late 1950s and had largely disappeared by the early 1960s, although surviving garments and quilts show that the material remained in use long afterward. The system did not end because families suddenly forgot how to be resourceful. It ended because the package itself changed. A paper feed bag could still carry chicken mash, but nobody was going to turn it into a respectable Sunday dress. Return to that farmer at the feed store. At first, he appears to be purchasing one thing: food for chickens. But the feed may support the farm, the sack may clothe a child, the scraps may enter a quilt, and the pattern may determine which company receives the family's money. The woman wearing the floral dress was not merely making do with a feed company's packaging. Eventually, the feed company was designing its packaging for her. That is what makes this more than a charming story about old-fashioned recycling. It is a story about household labor becoming consumer power, about necessity influencing design, and about an ordinary object carrying two entirely different products at once. One was the feed inside, the other was the future hidden in the fabric. If your parents or grandparents preserved a feed sack quilt, dress, towel, or family story, share it in the comments. Those memories are part of the history that museum labels cannot always recover. And feed sacks were not the only ordinary material Americans made work twice. Before refrigerators, families turned winter ice, cellars, springs, and even sawdust into an entire food cooling system. Watch our video about the 12 forgotten ways Americans kept food cold before refrigerators, and you'll see another part of the household ingenuity that modern convenience made almost invisible.